Eugene E. Oikari in Normandy invasion 1944. Emil Oikari moved to Canada in 1898. He had left his native Finland in Europe and the village of Karstula the same year, and from Canada he moved to Chisholm. Chisholm was a small village with only a dozen of buildings and a logger's cabin in the middle. A portitalo, which means a boarding house in Finnish, was situated in the village. In 1902, two young men from Karstula, Finland, walked down the track to Chisholm, Minnesota. They arrived to a newly founded shabby village where large tree trunks and rocks surrounded the lake street, decorating the passage. There was no sidewalks and a few yards of picket fence was put up beside the street. More than half of the population in Chisholm were young Finnish men who had just arrived in the village. Emil Oikari's son, Eugene E. Oikari, was born in 1912 and he was the youngest of a family of 8. He was the cousin of our grandmother Elsa and her sister Wilma. He went to the elementary school in Chisholm and later to college for 2 years. Before joining the army, he worked and lived in Cook County, Illinois, near the Chicago metropolitan area. He joined the army as an enlisted man in May 1942. Place of enlistment was Atlanta, Georgia, and from military records we can see that his profession was an office clerk, doing general office work. His basic training period lasted 3 months, and after that he was transferred to England. The unit was the 29th Infantry Division, 116th Regiment. In the fall of 1942, this division crossed the Atlantic Ocean on the famous Cunard Line ocean cruisers Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth from New York to England. The 116th Regiment traveled on the 26th of September on Queen Mary, and the ship was transformed to take in even 15,000 soldiers at once. The conditions were harsh, and the men took turns sleeping in bunk beds in 8-hour shifts. These ships were fast and could cross the Atlantic Ocean in 5 to 6 days, compared to the other ships 2 weeks. The German submarines could not aim their torpedoes fast enough for these dodging cruisers. The Queen Mary collided with the British cruiser HMS Curacoa on the 2nd of November 1942. The Curacoa was ordered to protect the Queen Mary, and on board were the 10,000 men of the 29th Division on their way to England. The zigzagging pattern of the Queen Mary surprised the HMS Curacoa, and the massive ocean liner split it in half. The Queen Mary continued ahead at normal speed because it had orders not to stop because of the German submarines. Over 300 British soldiers drowned in the accident, and other ships rushed to their aid, and some 100 persons managed to survive. The eyewitnesses could not talk about the accident due to reasons of national security, and the case was made public only after the war. The Queen Mary arrived safely at the Greenock Harbour in England. In the middle of May 1944, the 116th got a surprising order to move to special training camps in Plymouth and Weymouth area. The 116th Infantry Regiment had an assignment to invade a sector of the beach in Normandy, codenamed Omaha Beach. These isolated new camps were heavily guarded and surrounded by barbed wire fences. Only some 200 military personnel knew about the details of the plan, where the Stonewallers or the 116th Regiment would spearhead the attack of the division. Several of the men in the 116th had known each other for months, some even for years. The presence of the American forces in Britain was not to be without conflicts. 2 million Yanks caused all kinds of cultural collisions, and the military made public relation campaigns to ease the tension between the two cultures. The famous saying at the time went, "They're overfed, overpaid, overdressed, and overhear." The British criticized the Americans as being materialists, and to them USA was a corrupted country where a working man had no right to organize. The Americans in turn did not trust the imperious Brits and their will to go to war, and considered Britain as a diminishing empire. The temptation of the young American soldier was great in the eyes of the young female population. The British women acted differently according to the Americans. They were more approachable than the girls back home. And chocolate, cigarettes, dinners and dating helped the interaction. The GI's paycheck could be multiple times better than the British soldiers' pay. The young Britons were overseas at war or situated somewhere in the British Isles. Segregation was a prevailing practice in the US Army. Only 10% of the troops could be black, and they could not lead white soldiers. Movie shows, bars and exercise facilities had to be organized for black soldiers. During wartime rationing in Britain, this all seemed to be a waste of resources, and the British police was not obliged to help the Americans oversee these laws. The embarkment to the ships was on the 3rd of June, but bad weather conditions postponed the D-Day. The 29th Division, that was called the Blue and Grey, had to spend 3 days in the rough seas waiting on the boats. A soldier carried 27 kilograms of equipment, a bayonet, a jacket against chemical warfare, rations, gas mask, a poncho, ammunition magazine, half kilo of TNT. Some had extra ammunition magazines for Browning automatic rifle, and a life-preserving belt. Eugene's regiment boarded the SS Empire Javelin in Weymouth, Dorset. The ship was anchored in the Portland harbor on the 5th of June 1944, and from there it sailed towards Normandy. On board was the 116th Regiment A Company, which had some 20 men from Bedford, Virginia. This company was the first to land on the Omaha beach, and it suffered the greatest losses. Bedford was a small town, about 2,000 people, and statistically they lost the greatest number of young men in the USA in the World War II. The American National D-Day Memorial Statue is in Bedford. The SS Empire Javelin was the base for the 551st Landing Craft Assault Flotilla, and the crew was from the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve Corps. From the 18 boats, 16 sank and others were severely damaged after the battles of the D-Day. When the landing crafts were approaching the Omaha beach, the troops had already been in the boats for 3 hours, getting seasick from the 1.5-meter waves that were rocking up and down the landing crafts. The 116th Regiment's target was a strip of the beach codenamed Dog Green. Despite of the rough seas and chaos, the 116th was arriving at the exact spot that was planned for them. Other companies were distracted from their original goals and could not keep up with the scheduled plan. As the troops were getting closer to the beach, they noticed that the missiles and artillery fire from the ships did not reach the beach or went far behind the enemy lines. This meant that the mines, barbed wire fence and traps were still in place. Some of the troops had to jump too early in the water because of the runnels, the currents in the tide. The 500-meter-long beach above the waterline was mined, and behind that were the German troops of the experienced 352nd Infantry Division. This division had been in the Eastern Front and had plenty of battle-hardened soldiers. Eugene Oikari was in one of the landing craft assaults numbered 1095, 1096 or 1097. The Americans were expecting a hard time with a lot of casualties invading the Omaha beach. Every infantryman had a uniform that was designed against gas attacks. Wet uniforms and equipment slowed down the movement so much that it looked like the men were moving in slow motion when they tried to run for cover. 90 minutes before H hour, something went wrong. The bombings didn't hit the beach, instead they dropped deep behind enemy lines. The majority of the bombs and rockets fell much too early, exploding in the sea, and only a few German pillboxes were damaged. After action reports said that the air support was afraid of bombing the US troops. The 2nd Ranger Battalion C Company attacked alongside the 116th Infantry Regiment. The fierce firing focused more on the 116th, and they didn't have the cover offered by the cliffs unlike the Rangers did at the other end of the beach. The C Company is believed to be the first one of the Allied forces to break through the beach inland. The company's fast progression is portrayed in the movie Saving Private Ryan, directed by Steven Spielberg. The landing crafts had made a precise schedule and route in the invasion, but the waves and intense firing made it very hard for the steermen to steer the boats. Suddenly, the boat could be in the middle of mines, and the pressure of the battle confused the navigation. The 29th Division did not have experience in combat, even though they had practiced in hard conditions on the moors of Scotland with the British commandos. When the fighting began and the first casualties were reality, the beach line was filled with dead or wounded soldiers, and they could not be helped under heavy firing. Eugene E. Oikari was in the 1st Battalion Headquarter Company. The 3 landing crafts of this unfortunate company landed several hundred yards to the west of their target, the Door Green sector. The Headquarter Company, the Command Group and the Beachmaster's party, who directed the vehicles on the beach, were now landing on the beach where the cliff was. The officers and non-commissioned officers of the Headquarter Company suffered heavy losses, including the commander of the 58th Field Artillery Battalion. Those who were able to make it to the beach were exposed to enemy fire because there was no cover on the beach. This attempt to run for cover caused half of the estimated company losses. The cliffs offered some cover for those who survived the crossing. The men curled up behind every rock and burrow they could find. The command group was separated from the rest of the battalion and tried to keep contact with the radio. The sharpshooters' constant firing kept them in the same place for the most part of the day. Sergeants Naulin, Bauer and Belinsky of the 1st Battalion's Headquarter Company told about the events on the beach in the US Army interviews. Naulin of the Communications Group saw the men jump from the LCAs in full battle gear. They reached the other group carrying their equipment and were struggling to get to the sand strip formed by the tidal waves. The crossfire hit them immediately, whipping the sand and water around them. Naulin was startled to see his men stumbling forward with their burdens. Behind the first groups on the ramp of the landing craft, the movement had quieted. Commander McQuaid of the 58th Field Artillery was hit as he stepped to the water, and he died there. Captain Robert Wade got hit between the eyes just after he made it to the beach. Lieutenant James Limber was wounded on both legs when he was wading in the sea, and after he slept to the beach, he got hit in the head by shrapnels. The headquarter company battle report continues like this. This was slowing down the attack for several minutes before the rest of the men were able to dash to the beach. At that time the rising tide water was already covering most of the beach. Like the company before them, this company's officers and non-commissioned officers were hit first, and only 2 of the GIs were killed. The beach was smooth, rugged and exposed across 100 meters before the cliff started. The surviving soldiers ran towards it because it was the only place that offered some kind of shelter. In half an hour most of the men had gathered there. Lieutenant Wayland C. Hooks, who died later in the battle, got an order from Major Dallas to proceed up on the right side of the cliff. Sergeant James B. Smallwood, who was intact in a safe place under the cliff, accompanied Hooks and was killed in action later in the afternoon. They picked ammunition and explosives from their dead and wounded fellow soldiers. Many were hunkered down, unable to move because of the crossfire, and even the slightest attempt to move caused a burst of rifle fire from snipers and machine guns. All 3 LCAs landed separately only a few minutes apart from each other, and now the German firing was able to concentrate on one boat at a time. Lieutenant Colonel John A. Metcalf, who was on the first boat, lost 6 of his men, and half of the group was wounded in its attempt to cross the beach and the uncovered strip of sand. Everybody was hit from the rifle fire. Wallace and Metcalf with 6 other soldiers pushed their way to safety behind the boulders of the cliff. The constant heavy firing kept them there until late in the afternoon. Their losses eventually paralyzed their unit and it was not organized anymore. The command posts were only about 100 meters away from each other and they had radio contact. Metcalf was behind the boulders and Dallas in the gorge. All those men who were able to move forward were sent up the cliff with hooks. The few that were left at the command post concentrated on defending their position and protecting the wounded. Most likely, somewhere during this battle, Eugene E. Oikari was killed in action. The communications connections were poor because most of the radios were destroyed or lost in the chaos of the landing. A stream of soldiers was filling the beach, and the pioneers tried to blow up tank traps and mines so that the tanks and other vehicles could operate. Some of the pioneers, however, ended up in wrong parts of the beach because of the strong currents and the heavy resistance from the Germans. The pioneers' work was almost impossible to do. After an hour from the start of the invasion, small groups finally were able to break through the beach. Almost 6,000 American soldiers were transported to the shore, and gradually the German troops had to leave their pillboxes and positions. The Americans were in Normandy to stay. 2,400 soldiers were killed in Normandy. 65% of the victims died during the first 10 minutes of the invasion on Omaha Beach. The 116th Regiment lost 341 men. The A Company lost 96% of their strength during the first 10 minutes. Eugene E. Oikari, technician 5th grade, served in the 116th Regiment Headquarter Company. He was killed in action on the 6th of June 1944, and he is buried in the American Cemetery in Colville-sur-Mer, Normandy. His grave is on Area 1, Row 14, grave number 27. There's blood and Bibles on the shore. I'm about to drown, can't swim no more. I got your picture by my side. There's nowhere to go and the tide is high. I can hear them, I can't see them. I try to run but my legs don't move. Never been scared in my life before. I gotta keep moving, 29, let's go. The first to go. Where's the others? I don't know. I don't remember what the priest said. Stay here and I'm gonna be dead. I can hear them, can I see them? I try to run but my legs don't move. Never been this scared in my life before. I gotta keep moving, 29, let's go.